Hello, everybody. And we're going to talk about an issue that usually is not talked about, even though it should be asked. Where did Jesus get his knowledge from? What was the basis of his extensive knowledge, and was it typical knowledge for somebody who would grow up in a small town like Jesus did? So you can see that the answer on the first page is not the right answer. Jesus did not go to Jesus College. So where did he go, and what did he know? So let's get started. Did Jesus know the 3 R's? Well, let's see. In Luke 4, we read, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, stood up to read." I'm not going to get into the translations of King James, but he read from the Bible. So reading, beyond doubt, he had. In John 8, we read, "The sole case that we have any mentioning of Jesus doing anything close to writing," and it says, "This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground." What he wrote, we'll deal with later and try to answer the question if he knew how to write. Well, let's see, we have the 2 cases he wrote. Did he know arithmetic? That's a problematic issue, because if he was to calculate, let's say 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish can probably serve 15 people, but his answer was 5,000, he wouldn't pass most math tests, but as an investor, he would do very well. We don't know, but basic math, most people would have studied. So what would an educated Jew have known? So let's look at Paul, because Paul was the epitome of the educated person in many ways, and let's see what Paul knew. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he was asked by the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek?" The fact that Paul knew Greek surprised this Roman. So the knowledge of Greek, of Jews who lived in cities that had large Greek populations, yes. Outside of that, most likely not. Now, Paul tells us where he got his knowledge from. "I am a Jew born in Tarsus, but brought up in the city at the feet of Gamliel." In other words, Rabbi Gamliel was one of the great Jewish scholars in those days, had taught him directly. So the wealthier, more affluent Jews would have private tutors, and then they would be able to greatly extend their Jewish knowledge. Brought up in the feet, we learn in Pirkei Avot, probably written there, that is documented in the 3rd century, but dates back more or less to the time of Jesus. It said, Yossi ben Yoezer used to say, "Let thy house be the house of meeting of sages." In other words, if you bring sages into your houses, then you sit in the very dust of their feet, similar to Martha and Mary, and drink their words with thirst, which more or less is exactly what Paul testified he did. In Galatians 6, we learn a very interesting thing. He's sending a letter to the Galatians, and this is what he says: "And we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith." And then he makes a very interesting comment, which is usually overlooked. And he says, "Ye see how large a letter I have written." In other words, not that the whole letter is long, but there are some very large letters there. "I've written unto you with my own hand." In other words, Paul is saying, more or less, I wrote my signature all by myself. So even Paul, an educated man, would have had a scribe, because the probability of his learning how to write was very small. And Paul, in this testimony, clearly says, I don't write my letters, but I was able to write something big at the end. Now, in Acts 22, we read, "Brothers and fathers, listen to the defense that I now make before you." When they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. In other words, Hebrew was not the typical language spoken there, but the knowledge of speaking in Hebrew was special. Learning in Hebrew, for sure. Speaking was because most people would have spoken in Aramaic. And then once again in Acts, he says, now during those days when the disciples were increasing in numbers, the Hellenists, we have the conflict within the Judo-Christian community of the Jesus followers, the group, and you had the Hellenists on one hand and the Hebrews on the other. But the Hebrews were not called Hebrews because they spoke Hebrew, but they spoke Aramaic, just as a little side comment. So did children study in the days of Jesus? We have an interesting source from the Babylonian Talmuds. We're talking much later, 6th century, but quoting people who lived even before Jesus. And it says this, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, however, remember that man for good, and Yehoshua ben Gamla is his name. If not for him, Torah would have been forgotten from Israel. Why? At first, a child who had a father, his father taught him. In other words, we now learn how Jewish children would have studied. Someone without a father would not learn. In other words, if you didn't have a father who could teach you, you would just lack knowledge. From where do we derive this? And you shall teach them, in other words, the biblical commandment from the book of Deuteronomy, and you shall teach them. That enacted that children's teachers should be appointed in Jerusalem. That's just a conclusion that they came to. But we know, and then at the very bottom over here, until Ben Gamla enacted that children's teachers should be appointed in every district in town, and the children should enter school at the age of 6 or 7. Now, was this actually implemented? No. Larger cities, yes. But again, usually in later times, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century for sure. But originally a child would be taught by his father, then there was the change. Then we have a separate source in the Jerusalem Talmud. It says he, Shimon ben Shattach, not Yehoshua ben Gamla, but Shimon ben Shattach, enacted 3 things. And one of them was, and the children should go to school. So there were schools, but the question is where? Now we have somebody that'll give us good additional source, so somebody called Jesus ben Sira. Jesus, no connection to Jesus, just it was a very typical name in those days. And he wrote a book, 2nd century BC, and he says this, draw near unto me, ye unlearned, and dwell in the house of learning. So, unlearned people, there is a place to study. Was that a synagogue? There were already synagogues in those days, very possible. Do not ignore the discourse of the aged, for they themselves learned from their parents. So how do you learn? From your parents. From them you learn how to understand and to give answers when needs arise. He who teaches his son will make his enemies envious and will glory in him among his friends. So once again, who teaches? A father. When the father dies, he does not seem to be dead, for he left behind one like himself. He allowed him to hear his voice and led him into the dark cloud and gave him the commandments face to face, the law of life and knowledge, so that he might teach Jacob the covenant and Israel his decrees. In other words, even though there were houses of dwellings, 2nd century BC, 150 years before Jesus, that's how it was. And then in his commandments, he gave his authority and statutes and judgment to teach Jacob. Jacob, in other words, it's a parallel. There's the testimonies and the enlightenment of his law. So before Jesus' time, we know for sure how it was done. Now, from Qumran, we found a very interesting scroll, not me personally, but an amazing scroll was found. And it says, from his youth, this is what it says, they shall teach him the book of Hago. Hago is probably the rules of the community. There's arguments exactly what it is, but that's usually what is accepted. And according to his age, they shall instruct him the laws of the covenant. He shall receive instruction in the rules for 10 years. In other words, you need to study for 10 years. Now remember, this is a unique cult that existed, but in the time of Jesus, influenced John the Baptist, even had a slight influence on Jesus for sure. If he proceeds well, then at age 20, he shall be registered so to enter his allotted place within the family. In other words, within the community, and to join the congregation of holiness. This is known as the rule of the congregation. Philo, again, Jewish philosopher around the time of Jesus, also testifies about the people of Qumran. They arranged the rows according to their ages. The younger below the elder. They sat, again, just to give a basic idea of how he defines, but of all ages were there studying. This is the actual scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Looks very much like the Torah scroll that we see today. So we're talking about homeschooling. How would homeschooling go? When a child began to talk, his father shall speak with him in the holy language, in other words, in Hebrew, because that's the language you learn the Bible in, teaching him the Torah, in other words, the 5 books of Moses. But if he does not speak with him in the holy language and teach him Torah, it is as if he would bury him. So, not teaching your child Hebrew, so, of course, Jesus would have known Hebrew. Rabbi Nehorai, and again, we're talking from the Mishnah, quoting from more or less time of Jesus once again, says, I will abandon every profession in the world, and I will not teach my son anything but Torah, for a person enjoys its rewards in this world, with the principle remaining for him in the world to come. But all other professions are not so. When a man comes to sickness or old age or suffering and cannot engage in his profession, he must die of starvation, whereas the Torah is not so, for it guards him from all evil in his youth and gives him a future and hope in his old age. In other words, the importance above everything of studying Torah. Of course, that was not the case, and we'll see that soon. But from a young age, a father has the obligation to teach his son. How was reading taught? And this is very interesting. How would you teach them to read? Because they would, if there was a possibility, somebody would be taught to read. And this is how it was done. We find this in a much later source, around 6th century, but it dates back to the time of Jesus. And this, so to picture, and again, put yourself in that perspective of how would Jesus have learned to write in those days? And you can actually, or any Jew in those days, but you can actually picture what it would look like. And this is what it would look like. He went with his son, and they sat down by the school teachers. He said to one, Rabbi, teach me Torah. He then took hold of one end of a tablet, and his son took hold of the other end. The teacher wrote down Aleph Bet for him, the first 2 letters of the alphabet, and he learned them. Aleph to Tav, from the first letter to the last letter. We talked about Aleph and Tav, Alpha, Omega, which really was what was said, Aleph, Tav, and he learned them. And then they learned the book of Leviticus. The first book would be the book of Leviticus, and he learned it. And he went on studying until he learned the whole Torah. So the way it would be written, here you can see a tradition that exists till today, is the first day a child in the ultra-Orthodox world learns, they have all the letters in front of them and they're covered with honey. And that's a tradition that dates back at least 1,000 years, very possible much more, because you want the taste of learning to be sweet. Now, this teaching system is very interesting because we come across a Roman source from the 1st century, and it says this, but as soon as, but this, again, we're talking about the elite of the Roman society, not just your average Roman. And it says, but as soon as the child have begun to trace the forms of the letter, it will not be improper that they should be cut for him as exactly as possible on a board. Same thing. That his stylus may be guided along as along grooves. For he will then make no mistake as on wax, because wax it can spread, because that must have been a system that was rejected. Since he will be kept by the edge of each side and will be unable to stray beyond the boundaries. By following these sure traces rapidly and frequently, he will form his hand and not require the assistance of a person to guide his hand with his own hand placed over it. So once again, you learn the letters, you feel the letters. This is an amazing stone found in the Golan Heights. It says Beit Midrash, it says a place of study. This is where you would be teaching children. This stone is now on display in the Israel Museum. Interesting enough, it is limestone, even though the stone in the Golan Heights is basalt, volcanic stone, because it was important enough to make a special gateway for a place of study. I'm going to sidestep for 1 second because I found it extremely intriguing. And we read, Laeta, the daughter-in-law of Paula. This is, again, we're talking 4th century, and Saint Jerome, who lived in Bethlehem, who translated the Bible into Latin. Having written from Rome to ask Jerome how she ought to bring up her infant daughter, also called Paula. As a virgin consecrated to Christ, Jerome now instructed her in detail as to the child's training and education. Get for her a set of letters made of boxwood, just as we just read before, or ivory. No, nowadays he'd be arrested, but that's a different story, and called each by its proper name. Let her play with these so that even her play may teach her something, and not make her grasp the right order of the letters and see that she forms their names into a rhythm, but consistently disarrange their order and put the last letter in the middle and the middle ones at the beginning, that she may know them all by sight. She doesn't have to know how to write them, but she has to know them as well as by sound. Moreover, so soon as she begins to use the style upon the wax, which was discredited by the previous source, and her hand is still faltering, either guide her soft fingers by laying your hand upon hers, and else have simple copies cut upon a tablet, once again. So the teaching systems were more or less the same. This is, we're talking about in the 4th century. These are letters of Saint Jerome. So we talk about a father's obligation. In the Talmud, because again, what would Joseph have been obliged to do? And here are the things the father has to do for his son. The Gemara, in other words, the Talmud comments, according to this interpretation, we learn in the Mishnah, 3rd century, that which the sages taught in the Braita, which is a source from the same time as the Mishnah. A father is obligated with regard to his son to circumcise him. We know that Jesus was circumcised. To redeem him if he is the firstborn son. That was the presentation in the temple when he was redeemed. Who must be redeemed by payment to a priest, just as we read. And teach him Torah. And to marry him to a woman. That did not take place, unless you're Mr. Brown, and then maybe it did take place, but just joking. And to teach him a trade. Very interesting. We'll see if that was done. And some say a father is obligated to teach his son to swim. Rabbi Judah says a father who does not teach himself a trade teaches him banditry, listut, to steal, because if he doesn't have a profession, he's going to find the sources. So what did Joseph teach Jesus? This is the synagogue church in Nazareth. It's from the Crusader period, but traditionally this is the synagogue Jesus went to, and we'll talk about that a bit very soon. So in Matthew we read this, and when he was come into his own country, he taught them in their synagogues, in so much that they were astonished and said, whence hath this man this wisdom and these mighty works? When Jesus comes in, where does he have this knowledge from? In other words, it did not come from Nazareth, which is something we need to remember. In other words, everybody there says, wait a minute, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not this his mother called Mary and his brethren, James, Joseph, or really Yossi, and Simon and Judas? Wait a minute, where does this guy have this knowledge from? We don't have this type of knowledge in Nazareth. And his sisters, are they not all with us? Of course, in the Bible, women are not named by name unless they have a special purpose. The New Testament can continue the Hebrew Scriptures tradition. Whence then has this man all these things? And they were offended at him. But Jesus said unto them, a prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. Country is really his own town. Interestingly enough, in Arabic, Medinat, which in Hebrew means a country, in Arabic means a city. So when there's the exchange even over there, and in his own house. So Jesus had phenomenal knowledge, but where did it come from? And he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. In Mark, we have a slightly different story, which gives us an interesting perception. And when the Sabbath day was come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, "For whence hath this man these things? And what wisdom is this which is given unto him? And even such mighty works wrought by his hands. Is not this the carpenter?" Not the son of the carpenter. Now, we're not going to get into was Jesus and Joseph, were they carpenters? The Greek word is tekton, which means somebody who works with his hands. It could have been an ironsmith. The tradition developed that he was a carpenter, probably because that's the nicest of the works you do with your hands. But he is the carpenter. So Joseph, as we learned before, the obligation to teach your son a profession, and that was done. But Jesus said unto them, "A prophet is not without honor." Now, the word prophet is very important because, one, it's interesting, it's not with capital P, and it's misunderstood. In Hebrew, the word is navi. The word of navi comes from the source of niv in Hebrew, which means a word. A navi is somebody who speaks God's words. He's reading from the Bible, he's interpreting them, he is speaking God's words. Not somebody who foresees the future. Some people in the Jewish tradition would say, more than to foresee the future, to change the future. So he's speaking God's words. A prophet, a navi, he is speaking God's words. And then, when he came to Nazareth, going to look, he unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And then he interpreted it. And he explained it, and he had amazing things. But the truth is, I'm reading the bolded areas, but the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah. You need to know your history. You need to know your Bible to be able to say that. Yet, once again, the bolded areas. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow. How does he know these things? There were also leopards in Israel in the time of Elisha. So you need to have serious knowledge and the ability to interpret. People in Nazareth didn't have that. So what can we learn? So let's go back and see, when did Jesus' knowledge start and where did it come from? We have the story of Jesus in the temple, and Luke tells us. And when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem seeking him. Again, nowadays, Jesus would have been taken away from Joseph and Mary and put under social services, because you don't leave a kid for 3 days and suddenly discover he's not there, but different times. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of doctors. Interesting enough, in those days, doctors also were considered knowledgeable, educated people, but hearing them and asking them questions. Now, asking questions is very important because the Jewish way of study is based on questions. In Judaism, every question is legitimate. And a smart person is somebody who knows how to ask the questions much more than somebody who knows the answers. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. So he also had the answers, but his knowledge was phenomenal. And he was a 12-year-old boy. In other words, he had learned all this before 12. And when they say to him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, "Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowings." His parents were also surprised. And he said unto them, "How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my father's business?" In other words, and they understood not the saying, they didn't understand exactly what Jesus was saying, which he spake unto them. In other words, even his parents were taken back by his knowledge of a 12-year-old boy. What does that tell us? That the knowledge had not come from Joseph, or some of the knowledge had not come from Joseph. So let's see what Jesus did know and did not know. Reading, we for sure know he knew. He learned a profession. He was a carpenter or a tekton. He knew Bible. He could quote the Bible well. Interpretation, we saw how amazingly he interpreted throughout the New Testament, but in the story in Nazareth. Jewish law, his challenging the Pharisees all the time. he knew Jewish law. That's how he was able to challenge them. Swimming. Okay, well, luckily for Jesus, he did not need to know how to swim because he could walk on water. Why learn to swim if you could walk on water? Jesus was most likely not taught to swim because in the area he lived in, there was no major body of water. And last but not writing. You can see a beautiful depiction of Jesus writing on the ground with his hands. So could Jesus write, and who could write? In John 8, as we quoted before, Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees, remember that, we're going to talk about that very soon, brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? And of course they were trying to trick him and set him up, even though, again, the actual ruling, and that's how it's misdepicted, that you have people waiting with stones to stone her. Only a court can find somebody guilty, and it has to be based on two witnesses who warned her ahead of time. And it might have been a play also with Jewish law to see to what extent he knew Jewish law. But he was slightly smarter than that. They said, tempting him, that they might have accused him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. The word in Greek is ketgraphin, which is very interesting because it's not really writing. We'll see the Hebrew translation and we'll get a better idea, as though he had not heard him. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, he that is without sin amongst you, let him cast the stone at her. Because in the Jewish tradition, in the Bible, there's a commandment that the hand of the witness will throw the first stone. But if you guys are most likely not even qualified to be witnesses, so you can't even cast the first stone. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. The translation is wrote on the ground. The Hebrew translation of the text is probably accurate, and it says, Ach lenasototo dibru zot limtzo alav sitna. Interesting enough, sitna is from the same root as the devil. In other words, to find a devilish element in Vayakov Yeshua lemata vayitav be'etzba'o. Yitav is just he made lines or signs, or another translation is chakak. In other words, most likely he did not actually write words or letters. Because who could write in those days? We have throughout the Bible, we have many, many people that we are told would be scribes. In Isaiah, we are said, and he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe. Interestingly enough, a bula, a stamp of Shebna, was actually found in the city of David. So Shebna was the scribe, and then there were elders and there were priests. In other words, the scribe was somebody whose job was he would be the one that would do the writing. In Jeremiah, we find the most famous scribe in the Hebrew scriptures, Baruch the son of Neriah, who's said to have written additional books, and it says specifically, and Baruch wrote from the mouth of Jeremiah. In other words, the books were written, were dictated, and the scribe would write them. And Shemaiah, the son of Netanel, the scribe, but in this case he was also a Levite, wrote them before the king and the princes, and Tzadok the priest. So you have all these people, but the scribe is the one who knows how to write. Now, there were cases, there were people who were knowledgeable, etc. And Ezra, and that's why till today in Hebrew, Ezra is known as Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe. He was a priest, he was a leader, he was a knowledgeable person, because it says, and he was a ready scribe in the law of Moses. So he was, in this case, he could both write, but he was also a scribe. Of course, in the story of Esther, the king calls all the scribes to them. And interesting enough, in the book of Deuteronomy, we read, judges and officers shall thou make thee, And that's a mistranslation, because shoftim v'shotrim, in Hebrew it's now translated as policemen, or people who are in control of the of turning the rulings of the judge into physical activities. Shotrim comes from the word shtar. Shtar in Hebrew is a document. So you had the judges and the people who would write down the judgments. So then here you have the shotrim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sharecha. Every city had to have its scribes. This happens to be the bula, the stamp of Baruch ben Neriah. And to make things even crazier, you can see this upper area over here. A fingerprint was found on that. So is it Baruch's fingerprint or a fingerprint probably of him pushing it down? We don't know, but that's an actual fingerprint taking us back 2,500 years. We go back to Jesus ben Sirah, and he had affinity for scribes, because he actually was also able to write. The scribe's wisdom increases wisdom. In other words, the scribe can at times even interpret. Whoever is free from toil can become wise. In other words, because the scribe just writes things down, he's free of toil, he can see things that other people might not see. So that's just an interesting little comment. Here you can see this was found in the Dead Sea. This is people practicing how to learn how to write. The scribes in Qumran would practice on, it was in Astrakhan, would practice on a broken piece of pottery. Here are people learning the Hebrew letters, practicing how to write them. The earliest, the earliest Hebrew writing, which is Proto-Canaanite writing, more or less 9th century BCE, was found in Gezer, one of the three towns that were, one of the three major towns built traditionally in the time of King Solomon. Also the town given to King David by Pharaoh when he married his daughter. And here you have, some people say it's even a child's homework, because it deals with the different months of the year, the month that we harvest, the month that we cut the grapes, etc. An amazing, amazing, amazing find that was there. So we come across Pharisees and Scribes in pairs all the time. But there was a certain of the scribes sitting there and reasoning their hearts. Why does this man speaketh blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, this is a cynical comment on the scribes, because scribes, your job is to write and shut up. So you think you have more knowledge than Jesus and all you do is write things down? But the Pharisees were the knowledgeable, were the teachers, and in that case, it's already something. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, who is this which speaketh blasphemies? So we have the same story, in one case making fun of the scribes, another case, those two groups coming together. The Pharisees, those that were represented here, were knowledgeable in the Bible, and they had their scribes alongside to deal with it, because they could also serve as moving courts, because they were knowledgeable people. So 3 people could serve as a court to deal with many issues, and then the scribe would write things down. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together once again and led him into the council. So we have the scribes are there to document what needs to be said. Then spake Jesus to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They take the most important seat in the synagogue, which is where the leaders are supposed to sit, and therefore whoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. In other words, you have to, and here is an actual seat, which is the seat of Moses, which was found in Chorazin, one of the 3 cities cursed by Jesus. That was actually found in the synagogue there. So where did Jesus acquire his knowledge? Matthew 13 we read, and when he was cometh into his own country, he taught them in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished, as we read before. And then in John 1 we read, Philip findeth Nathanael, and saith unto him, we have found him, of whom Moses in the law. And what is Nathanael's response? Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? So nothing good could come from Nazareth. That's what Nathanael said to Philip, and Philip said, "Come and see." So we can understand from there that anybody from outside of Nazareth, most people probably didn't even know where Nazareth was, since Cana is is relatively close to Nazareth. Even though those of you who visited Israel, and when you visit Cana, I hate to say that's not the historical Cana, but that's a different issue. But what good could come from Nazareth? So you don't expect anybody knowledgeable to come out of Nazareth because, one, it's not a city of any level of wealth that they could afford high quality rabbis / teachers. And so the fact that Jesus got his knowledge, it had to have come from somewhere beyond Nazareth. So let's understand a little bit about Nazareth. Here's a wonderful painting by the famous British artist Roberts, who painted the whole Middle East some 150 years ago, a little bit more even. So, how many people lived in Nazareth? It's questionable. The estimates are from between 140 in the low levels to maybe 600-700 in the high levels. Somewhere, and the way we know how many people live there is based on this picture. Not this picture, but there's only one spring in Nazareth. Those of you who have visited have seen the Church of Gabriel, the Church of the church, which the Orthodox Church, which is dedicated to the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she was going to give birth to a child, and basically we can know how much water flowed from the well. So based on that, we can get an idea of how many people lived in Nazareth. So now let's see where, to my opinion, Jesus went to school. Here's a short film, and this is the town or the city in those days of Tzippori or Sepphoris. The name Tzippori, as we're told in the Jewish sources, is based on the fact that you see it like a bird's view, beautiful ancient olive trees that are there. And let's get I'll show you a few shots of this, and then we'll understand. So here you see the Acropolis of Tzippori, and we'll see some of the amazing things that have been discovered here. So here are some Roman mosaics. This is a depiction over here. You see a missile-looking thing. That's known as a Nilometer, which is a depiction of the Nile, a beautiful mosaic of a centaur. This is from after Jesus' time. This is when it already was a fully Roman city, but we're going to deal with its evolution, its history, and how it will connect to Jesus. But we can get an idea of how important and a major city it is. You can see some beautiful scenery that's depicted from various, that is, again, this we're already talking about 2nd century, so a little bit after Jesus, some spectacular mosaics. Here we see a building on the top of the hill. This was a Palestinian school until 1948. This, of course, was built long, long before 1948. This was built by a Bedouin who was appointed by the Ottomans, Dar el-Omar, but once again, the archway is Crusader. This leads up to the top of but what we really want to see is this view. As we go around in this view, we'll see a city off on the hill. The city we see off on the hill, we'll see it in just a couple of seconds, or it's really the other direction. Let's go back a bit, and we'll get a nice view of Nazareth. Here is Nazareth of today. Now, it is around 4 to 4.5 kilometers away from Tzippori. Now, Tzippori was, and we'll talk about the history, was the major city in the whole region. Now, if 150 or 200 people lived in Nazareth, you can rest assured that there wouldn't be that much work for Joseph, for Jesus, or for his brothers. So it would be difficult. Here is a beautiful mosaic, considered the most spectacular mosaic anywhere in Israel. This woman over here is known as the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. It's a spectacular depiction of a mosaic made out of over 1.5 million stones. That's how they get to this amazing perspective. These are stories of Dionysus, and you can see the empty spaces where there would be there were 1, 2, and 3, there'd be 3 cots that would be there for people to sit down and study. Here you could say it says Yevi, it says to your health, because this is a private toilet inside a house. Here we see the Roman theater that was here, and the only Roman theater in Israel which is dug into the side of the hill. Around 4,500 to 5,000 people could come here. There are arguments amongst archaeologists. Is this from the time of Jesus or is it from a little bit later? You can see the carving into the stone, because traditionally this is how Greek theaters would be made, less so how Roman, but this is actually a Roman theater. So we can see some amazing remains of this spectacular city of Tzippori. As we move on, so Tzippori or Sepphoris, what is it? What is it? Here we can see just a small thing. This is a mosaic, we'll deal a little bit with it later, of the synagogue of Tzippori. Now, we're told in Jewish sources that there were, in the end of 2nd, early 3rd century, at least 14 synagogues in Tzippori. Your synagogue with a mosaic, any of you can figure it out. You can see Abraham and Isaac on the donkey as Isaac is being led to Mount Moriah, where Abraham planned to sacrifice Isaac. So, what connection is there between Jesus and Tzippori? One of you probably have never heard of it. It doesn't appear anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, and it doesn't appear, well, it's not mentioned by name in the New Testament. Why would Jesus have anything to do with Tzippori? Let's take a look at the map. We talked about Cana before, and it's mapped here. This is Nazareth. Here is where Cana is, where if you visit Cana, it would be here. Here is Sepphoris over here. It's around 4.5 kilometers. And it's the major city, Ptolemais, known as today, Nain, where the miracle of the widow took place. Here we have Mount Tabor, where the Church of the Transfiguration, and very close to the area of where Jesus did most of his teaching. So you can see how close we are geographically. So that's point number 1. So what is Tzippori? And let's look at its evolution. Gabinius in 57 AD brought Hyrcanus to Jerusalem and committed the care of the temple to him. We're talking about a very short time after the Romans captured the region in the year 63. And when he ordained 5 councils, he distributed the nation into the same number of parts. So these councils governed the people. The first was Jerusalem, the second was Gadara, the third was Amathus, the fourth was Jericho, and the fifth was Sepphoris in the Galilee. So the capital of the Galilee, as appointed by the Romans, was Sepphoris, or Tzippori, as it's known in Judaism. This we're told by Josephus. So the Jews were now freed of the monarchic authority and were governed by an aristocracy. But if this is one of the areas of control, of course there would be a small Sanhedrin, a group of 23 Jewish scholars who would serve as judges there. So there's a major rabbinical presence. Now, but there's a slight setback. In Sepphoris also, a city in the Galilee, there was one Judas. We're not going to get into the connection of the names, but this Judas was not a nice guy, the son of arch-robber Hezekiah. There's a very possible mentioning of him in the New Testament, who formerly overran the country and had been subdued by King Herod. This is, again, once again, the Jewish historian Josephus is telling us this. This man got no small multitude together, and break open the place where the royal armor was laid up, and armed those about him and attacked those that were so earnest to gain dominion. Varus, in the 4th century BCE, sent a part of his army presently to Galilee, which lay near to Ptolemais. In other words, they were based, as you saw on the previous map, near the city of Acco, and Caius, one of his friends, for the captain. This Caius put those that met him to fight and took the city of Sepphoris and burnt it and made slaves of the inhabitants. So, in the year 4 BC, around the time of the birth of Jesus, Tzippori was destroyed. Herod Antipas, you guys remember him, he was made the ruler, the tetrarch of the Galilee, also built the wall of Sepphoris. So we know which is the security of all the Galilee. Now the word in Greek is proschema, which means an ornament. That's why frequently Tzippori is known as the jewel or the pearl of the Galilee. He rebuilt it and made it the metropolis of the country. Now, when did this take place? And this is very important to us. This took place up until around the year 19 ACE. In other words, throughout a large part of that is our unknown period of Jesus's life. Now, who rebuilt it? And this we know, were people Herod Antipas made a point of getting people from the whole region around to rebuild it. You're a carpenter or an ironsmith or somebody who works with your hand, you're not going to have enough income from Nazareth. You will go and work in rebuilding the city, which takes you an hour to get to. So the probability that Joseph would have worked in Tzippori or in Sepphoris is extremely high. I would almost say it's quite sure. And who could have come along with him? Very possibly would have come along with him? Jesus. Now, it was, and in those days, most likely was also, and I can't say for sure, but at a very high probability, because once again, it was made the metropolis of the whole region, many Jewish teachers, scholars, and Jesus have been exposed to them. Because keep in mind that Jesus knows the Pharisees' ways very well. These people would have been Pharisees. He had to acquire it from somewhere that probably wouldn't have been much of a presence. So the probability that Jesus was in Tzippori, I would say, goes beyond doubt. We'll talk about why it's not mentioned very soon. But one thing we can be sure about, this is a very good chance where he might have studied. Now, there's an argument about Tzippori in the time of Jesus. There's a theory written by an assistant to an archaeologist who claimed it was a predominantly Roman city in the time of Jesus. That's been quite disproven. Now, you see this picture here. If you look closely, you'll see when you'll see it in person, you'll see it much better. You can see a menorah. This is carved into the pavement of the Decumanos, of the Roman road that is there. This was, again, most likely carved in by a Jew and very possible by a Jew who was actually in the temple. Now, what signs do we have that'll tell us that this was a Jewish city? We have ritual baths predating Jesus and from the time of Jesus. We have animal bones. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of animal bones that can be dated to the time of Jesus. All of those bones, or 99% of those bones, came from what we call kosher animals. In other words, animals that according to the Bible are permissible to be eaten by Jews. So there were no pig bones were found in later periods. We know there was a priestly presence there. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, because there was actually one of the 24 priestly families who would take turns serving the temple were based in Tzippori. And here is the story. Rabbi Yossi told the story of Yosef, the son of Elum from Tzippori. So here we have our Elim from Tzippori, who served under a high priest for 1 hour and was not qualified to be neither a high priest nor a lay priest when he left. In other words, we're told a story of a priest from Tzippori, because in those days, the high priest would change regularly. So he served under, in other words, he served literally as a high priest, but he was unqualified for it. Because in those days, unfortunately, in the time of Jesus for sure, and the bit before that also, and for a part of the time later, it was a political appointment to be a high priest. Many of the high priests were unqualified. Not get into the theology of the high priest, but what it does tell us is that there were priests who came from Tzippori who were of high enough rank to be able to get themselves. And here we have the Hebrew version, Amara biyosi maaseh biyosef ben ilim mitzippori sheshimesh tachat kohen gadol, that he served underneath her as the high priest. The Gemara, the Talmud from the 5th century tells us another story, which is very important, which really, now this is a little bit later, but for sure applies to the time of Jesus also. Rabbi Hanania found a slaughtered goat between Tiberias and Tzippori. So what? You find a slaughtered goat, the question is, can you consider it a kosher goat? That it was slaughtered in a kosher way, so a Jew can eat it. And the sages permitted it to him. Because from Tzippori, from Cephreus, all the way down to Tiberias, there was solely Jewish presence. So it was permitted. In a future lecture, we'll talk about that, because this was written in a later period, but where were the Christians in those days? Because this was written and dealt at the time when there already were the first Jesus followers, and that was the area of where they were based. We'll have a chance to discuss that in the future. Here we see a ritual bath, the steps leading down, and the actual ritual bath. The Jews would purify themselves, and we come across these from the 2nd century. We see here's another ritual bath, a major ritual bath within the remnants of the Jewish city. This is a source of water that then leads down into the bath. Here we see Hebrew writing from the time of Jesus on a shard of pottery. You can see the handle over here. You can see the Hebrew writing. We can date that to 1st century ACE. So that's from there. Here we see a large element of sifting through bones, I have to be honest, though that just to give you an idea of how the sifting takes place. That comes from Jerusalem and not from Cephreus, with the same element of. And here once again, we'll get a short tour of the synagogue of Cephreus that was found. It is spectacular. So here you can see, once again, Abraham and Isaac. You can see, interesting enough, it's depicted in Greek. Center is the horoscope with Helios. Interesting enough, in the middle of it, here we have the showbreads, the basket of abundance or plentiness. You can see, interesting, this is written in Hebrew, Nisan. That's because you have the 4 seasons on the 4 corners. Nisan is the time of Passover or of Easter. And here you can see the descriptions of various things that existed in the temple. The horns that would be blown, the sacrifices. Here you have the semolina that the cakes in the temple were made of, the bulls being bled, and here you can see the menorah. Now, what's interesting is the theory goes, but here you can see something that did not exist in the temple. If I apologize for the quality of the photography. This is where the ark would have been based. That woman, it does not date back to the time of Jesus, but here the ark would have been, and here you see a reflection of the ark on the floor and the 2 menorahs, which means to nowadays, modern day theory goes that what you see is a reflection of what actually was in this 4th, 5th century synagogue. Side comment, its orientation is wrong. Jewish temples and those synagogues in those periods always faced Jerusalem. This one did not, because of its geographical location. They could not build it in that direction. These are the donors. So they gave a donation 1,500 years ago, and we still remember them till today. Interestingly enough, early synagogues in the time of Jesus did not face Jerusalem. The synagogues, because Jerusalem was still in existence. the synagogues of the synagogues that we see, that we find after the destruction of the temple, are from are facing Jerusalem. This one is not, and the Jewish tradition says, even if you don't know the direction or it's not, what is important is that your heart faces Jerusalem. Now, so why isn't Tzippori mentioned in the New Testament? Part of the reason is this picture, not directly. Here we see Herod Antipas, and here we see John the Baptist. You guys remember what happened. Mark 6, for Herod himself had sent a man to John, bound him and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, that Antipas then married, because Herod had married her. Now, we have a problem because Philip is not called Herod. He was traditionally called Herod. Antipas was less called Herod. We're not going to get into the problems with that for Mark, but just a side comment. For John had been telling Herod, John the Baptist, it is not lawful for you to have your wife's brother, because that goes against the biblical law. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. In Luke, we're told, the same day there came certain Pharisees saying unto him, this is to Jesus after John the Baptist was decapitated. Get thee out and depart hence, Herod will kill thee. In other words, Jesus gets a warning that Herod wants to kill him. Where it was Herod's two main centers that he would live in, Tiberias and Caesarea. So once Jesus started his, or even before, we're talking again, year of decapitation of John the Baptist is between 28 and 34. Those are the traditional years. So once Jesus' ministry started, or once John the Baptist was decapitated, Jesus would not take the chance of entering these cities because he very much would have been arrested. Just an interesting side comment. Besides Jerusalem, Jesus stays away from major cities. That's not where he preaches. He preaches in not always small towns, but smaller towns. And we continue in Luke. And he said unto them, go ye and tell that fox, behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. So once again, Jesus prophesizing his future, but he refers to Herod Antipas as a fox. Nevertheless, I must walk today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet perish out of Jerusalem. I can't take the chance that I be caught in one of your cities. I will stay away from you. Interestingly enough, according to Luke, he's the only gospel that tells us when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man was Galilean. In other words, this is after Jesus' arrest. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, because the Galilee was divided up between Philip and Herod, he sent to Herod Antipas, who himself also was in Jerusalem at the time, because Herod would come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season. In other words, according to Luke, Antipas has been waiting to get hold of Jesus for so many years. So for that reason, Jesus would never enter the city of Tzippori or Tiberias. Tiberias is also not mentioned anywhere because he had heard many things of him and he hoped to see some miracles done by him. In other words, he had been searching for him. This is an interesting connection between Christianity and Tzippori, even though it's a later tradition. Another question frequently not asked, where does Mary come from? Where was Mary born? Many of you who have been to Jerusalem have seen the two places Mary was born in Jerusalem. That's a new meaning of multiple birth. There are two different churches dedicated to her. There's a third church. This is the remnants of a church. There is an actual church. It is functioning, you can see, but the exterior is partially damaged, of a church which is said to be the birthplace of Mary. Again, makes more sense of if Joseph was in Nazareth, higher probability of meeting a future wife than in Jerusalem. And the Piacenza pilgrim visited Dio Caesarea, which was the Roman name for Tzippori, in 570, and reported that the flagon and breadbasket of Mary were venerated there. In other words, tradition that they had the relic of that. He also states that the chair in which Mary was sitting when the angel came to her was also found in Dio Caesarea. So there's a connection between Mary and Tzippori or Sepphoris again, from the 6th century on. So where might Tzippori have been mentioned in the New Testament? Take a look at Tzippori here. Take a look at Tzippori here. Get a view of Tzippori from afar. So where might Tzippori have been mentioned? And here, once again, this is a picture taken from Nazareth of today. These buildings, of course, do not date to Jesus' time, but from anywhere in Nazareth, you see a hill. And in those days, this was in a major city on the hilltop. So where might Nazareth be mentioned? In the book of Matthew. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Today, more and more people agree that Jesus is talking about what he would have seen in his childhood. What he would have seen in his childhood was a city on a hill, and the city on a hill he would have seen from Nazareth, and the city that, to my opinion, he was very accustomed with, because where would he have come across rabbis that could have taught him both the extensive reading and the amazing knowledge that he had of Bible, of Jewish traditions, of Jewish law, of the Pharisee traditions that he challenged, that could not have come from Nazareth. At age 12, when he visited Jerusalem, he already had that knowledge. The city on the hill was most likely where Joseph would have gone to work, and most likely where Jesus would have accumulated amazing knowledge. The rabbis, if they would have come in contact with a young Jewish boy who had the ability and then to both learn, expend his knowledge, and extend his knowledge, would have made a major effort to teach him more and more and more. And that's why most likely the city on the hill, Tzippori, Sepphoris, is where Jesus went to school. So we end our lecture here. I hope you don't have to agree with me, but I would highly recommend, when you come to Israel, add Tzippori into your itinerary. It's a spectacular city, and I would say that you can say quite clearly you'll be visiting the school that Jesus went to. Thank you very much.